Every parent wants to make the right decisions for their child, but what happens when the experts don't agree? Well, from newborn care to chronic childhood illness, today's parents are navigating more questions and more confusion than ever before. Today, we're sitting down with integrative pediatrician Dr. Ed Sarraf to explore where modern medicine excels, where it may fall short, and how parents can make informed, confident decisions for their families. Dr. Ed, welcome to the Crackin Backs Podcast.
Thank you. I love your energy and really nice to meet you guys. I
Same
heard great
here.
things about you guys.
Thanks. Hey, Dr. Ed, let's start by asking you, you've spent years in both conventional and integrative medicine. When you look at today's children, compared to when you first started practicing, what concerns you the most?
Wow. Yeah. Everything. I mean, when you think about our own childhood and how we grew up, there's so many more diagnoses that are happening. There's so much more chronic disease that right now is there that it never was. I give a beautiful quote, when he was running for president, he was talking about, when Reagan was president, only 5% of our kids were on medications at that time in the 1980s. Right now, it's 55% of our kids that are on chronic medications. And for some reason, we're okay with that. It's this slow increase and we've just, been accustomed, we rationalize that these numbers are okay. And here you have one of the most incredible systems in the world that's spending the most amount of money in the world, for healthcare, and then what we really get is sick care.
Well, I'll tell you, you are a rare breed of pediatrician, and it makes me ecstatic to ask you questions like you mentioned just a moment ago that we're diagnosing more, but is it that kids are actually sicker, or are we simply diagnosing more?
Very good question, because that always becomes part of the debate, right? The answer is yes and yes. You know, uh, right? I mean, you can imagine how much, you know, everything has changed, right? I mean, when it comes down to schools. So I'll use schools as one example to my patients all the time about how everything's gone wrong. And we can go from schools to parenting to, our own, like government. You can go to, you know, every facet. When you think about it, our system has broken down. So let's use the school system. Okay. When I was I grew up in Beverly Hills area. I went to Beverly Vista Public School. And I remember when, one of the things we did was we played in an hour and a half, of sports. So an hour fully, right? We just played in the middle of the day, right? We had to take showers, get ready, and then go back to, classes. So during that time, I don't remember anyone taking an ADHD drug. So if your kid was moving, right, it was like wonderful. We expelled all that wonderful energy. And if you imagine ADHD boys, the stereotype boys move a lot more, right, and stuff like that. Now we see that in schools, we say ADHD, right, medicate. The kid's totally fine 1 year. The next year, that another teacher, is there with different standards and starts labeling this child. And then the parents come to me and say, this kid's problematic, doesn't sit, doesn't concentrate. Now, sports in schools, many of them is 30 minutes, maybe every day, maybe, a lot of schools are, 3 days a week, right? So, I mean, that's not sports. And then what we did was we played afterwards, right? We played another 2, 3 hours. We went home on our bicycles and we went home, like we ate, usually after your food. I'm going to get to food next, right? And and then we had this then you had the family time and so on and so forth. So what happens next, right? What do schools do? So they remove our movement. There are, and we know movement, releases brain-derived growth factor, for example. Good for our brain. Our brain needs it to grow, right? So it's not just body, not to mention our body, right? A lot of kids, are getting obese, right? And then where is it? During my time, again, we really had a very small proportion of kids who were overweight, low self-esteem, anxiety, then all the chronic problems. So this is why, you can see the transformation with time. That's number one. Now, tell me, what do our schools feed our kids? Right? Who is happy? Who is happy with their school system and what they feed the kids? Right? So I have I do want to read this because, one of my best friends is married to one of the top people in the school systems, when it comes to nutrition. And she came to take the job and she told me something a long time ago. And I texted her, I said, I want to know if I heard you correctly. Remind me how much money, that's spent on the food that their kids get. So I want to read this to you guys because it's sort of, this morning she texted me and she goes, the federal reimbursement is $4.71 for lunch, and California gives another $1.02, which totals $5.73, in which we have to serve a grain, a protein, a fruit, a veggie, and milk. And that includes the cost of labor to serve the meals. Okay? Straight from the horse's mouth, right? She's one of the top people in there. And that's what she has to work with. So now, how do you get good food on a plate, with those numbers, right? It's like insane, right? You have now ultra processed foods that are coming in, in order to feed the minds of the most important people in our world, because if we're parents, we know there's only one thing I would give everything up for. It's my kid. There's nothing I wouldn't give up for my kid, in order to make their, but yet we're giving up the most important thing when it comes to the fundamentals of helping their brains and bodies grow efficiently. So you wonder, okay, why are we having more of these problems, right? So, and that now is attached to the fourth thing that schools do terribly. They started putting what in the classrooms? How do they grade things? How do the kids learn? What do they do more now that we didn't have? I didn't have it. You didn't have it. What's in
Audio
front of them all the
visual,
time? What?
screens.
Yes. Yes. So schools are using screens more and more and more. The question is, we already have all this science that's showing how screens are terrible for the brain, right? So now the school system has gotten into it, right? So now, them getting into parental responsibility and everything else, right? But when you go into the one system that's supposed to, help our kids learn and grow and stuff like that, you have the three most important now screens. I just went over an article that Denmark published just a little while ago that showed that there is this Generation Z is the first generation of cognitive decline in the history, of humanity. First time kids can process less, their memory, executive function, able to learn, to reason, to solve problems. All of this is declining, and when Denmark did their study, they said it's, directly associated with screen time. So what they did for the 2025-2026 year, they removed all screens from the school system, all tablets, no phones, no nothing, and what they realized that the kids were happier, their scores started going back up. They started communicating again, and they started learning differently, right? So, we, for example, like, if we want to learn, there's different ways of learning. I can listen to an audiobook, which is what I recommend all my patients, my families do. My moms and dads are very busy, right? We're all very busy. Now, I live in LA and you guys live in LA too, right? Which means that half of our life, more or less, right? Half of our life we're in our cars. So I recommend all families to always listen to podcasts, listen to books and stuff like that. But listening is even different than reading, right? Reading processes differently in our brain. The vocabulary, the comprehension, the pauses that we have in order to process something, and what stimulates inside of our hearts and our brains and stuff like that. So we need kids to read, right? And so these are three major examples of only one thing, which is our school systems failing our kids. And it's a microcosm of all the bigger things that are there, because we can take the same things and we can now extrapolate and expand it to every other aspect of our lives.
Is that study that you were talking about, is that the one where they identified an atrophy of the myelin because they've spent so much time, screen time, and that therefore their nervous system is not processing fast enough? I mean, shocking what they're finding out about just the amount of screen time right now. Is there anything else that's trending that you see other than now, if we move out of school, what else is going on that
Yeah.
just
So
keeps
if
you
you
up at
so,
night?
exactly, I mean, so these are huge. So we talked about the processed foods, the lack of physical activity, and the screen time as being major things, right? With parenthood, now you go to parents, right? So we all have responsibility in order to do the best that we can. Okay, so most parents allow a ton of screen time. I want to expand this now, right? The kids come home, now they go play their, what are they, Minecraft, which I call marijuana. Okay, Fortnite, I call heroin. Okay, and Roblox, I call cocaine, right? So these are ridiculous, unbelievable dopamine releasers that kids do, usually by themselves or with the friends that they have in the computer, right? So they have some different connections, and that's how they make their friendships now, right? A lot of them. So this is part of the rationalization. Well, that's how they do it. So we allow the worst drugs, the bigger addictors, right? Smoking takes time and stuff like that, right? Alcohol, even, it's not immediate, right? But these things, they are made to be unbelievably addictive, and somehow parents allow it because they don't want their kids to be left out. But see, as soon as you start doing that, now you create a habit. And as soon as you create a habit, good luck breaking the habit. So part of it is that, right? We allow these things that we don't know. And the study you talked about, this one was more talking about how neuroscientists were lowering the standards, when it comes down to standardized tests and the lower attention spans. So they're studying that, and and these are part of the reasons that they do it. There's a lot of other things you can just, Google, ChatGPT, and all the other stuff that you can now do in order to see a bunch of studies, and there's also a beautiful book called The Anxious Generation, that, breaks down in different segments what screen times does to them. And the guy, I forget his name, and he's a national speaker now. He did a beautiful job discussing the different ways that the brain gets affected, especially for kids, because anxiety is chronic. It's awful. It's horrible. It's so sad. These kids are, they feel like they're on, they're worried to be doing anything, right? So and that's a big thing. Another thing that, with parenting, when I was a kid, I had a lot of boredom time. And when we were bored, tough, gaboozle. I don't know if I can curse here. I probably won't. But, tough shit. You had to figure out stuff. I remember looking at the ceiling, for example, for a long time. Then I got my rubber bands and I used to, shoot flies outside. It doesn't matter because you're spending time with yourself, whatever you were doing. And I'm not killing animals or anything like that. So don't judge me. All right. I can see it in your eyes, you know. So really, there was the fact that we had boredom time allowed us to process. Now we don't have any boredom time, right? It has to be constantly stimulated, hence our attention span issues, right? Chronic attention span issues, inability to process, inability to wait and have delayed gratification. These are all big problems. You don't have delayed gratification. You get a generation that wants, everything right now. They're not willing to work hard. You lose their drive, right? These become problems, right? Big problems, because my generation, we have to figure out stuff. Our parents worked their ass off. It was not easy. My parents lost everything. We were immigrants. We were one of the people, from Iran. The revolution happened. We had to leave everything if we wanted our life. And my dad went from rags to riches, you know, self-educating, coming here to the United States, going back, figuring it out, becoming super, uber rich. But again, having to leave everything, restart. So when he restarted, he had to work extremely hard in a new culture, a new thing, and times change. Everything is going to get harder. Another thing that you have to look into later on, and it's not part of this discussion, is AI and what it's going to do in this generation with jobs. So, and I think of my dad and how everything changed for him because he was able to monopolize things in Iran because they were just behind. Now AI is going to remove a massive amount of jobs coming in the future. So we need these kids to be 1,000 times more able to be able to figure out things, not the other way around. So we now, because our generation was tough and we figured a lot of things, we became extremely resilient and we were drivers. We were hungry. We were going to figure things out. Now, this generation, the same parents who went through hardship, they don't want their kids to go through hardship. They feel that they want to protect the kids, right? So everybody gets a medal, when it comes down to winning and losing, right? So you remove that extra drive of losing, right? Okay, you lose, you're sad. You're sad, you're mad. You're mad, it may be giving us extra drive to work harder later. But we don't do that right now. We overly praise all the things that they do, right? From when they're very little. So they go to school and no one's overly praising them for everything, right? Like, oh my God, that doesn't happen everywhere. So they go to school, they're like, hold on a second. This is not real life. What is it? Am I not good enough? Is there something wrong with me? Right? So these things start popping up faster. It used to be just during adolescence, so it's now a little sooner, right? We can all go back and feel a little of that, but these guys are getting a bigger version of that, right? And then what else? And so we don't want it to be disappointment. And one thing I thought about this morning, I'm like, I want everyone to watch the movie Inside Out, the first one, right? Do you guys ever watch that?
Mm-hmm.
You did, right?
Yep.
Do you remember, Terry, what it was about?
Yeah, it was about the brain, and each character was a different emotion.
That's right. And
Yeah.
what was the main driving emotion? So that was the second Inside Out. The first one wanted the kid to always be
Accepted,
positive.
popular. Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't want to bring sadness,
Yes. Yes.
right? At all in there. So I remember, I shed a tear a long time ago when I first watched that because there's such adult themes in there. It's such a beautiful, some of these things have very, very beautiful adult themes in there. So I want parents, if they're listening to this, to understand that they can protect their kids, but they can allow them to be uncomfortable. They can allow them to try to figure it out and don't solve all their problems, right? Give them some clues, but don't solve everything because again, you're removing things from them. You're removing their ability to want to get better, right? The kids who have everything, they're in trouble. The kids who have nothing, they become more resilient, depending on how they navigate their life. You know what I mean? So this is one of those very, very important things that parents have to take responsibility when it comes down to it.
See,
I'm
Terry, that's why I cried at the Barbie movie. He always teases me about that.
I should have watched that one.
No, you're fine, Ed.
Okay, thank you. I can skip one. I'm waiting for some good shows again. You guys have to
Yeah. Well, that's not one of them.
text me. Even the old movies were better. The previous cartoons were so much better.
Oh, the old Warner Brothers and the old Bugs Bunny, and oh my God, they were the best.
And tell me whose fridge when they had it 30 years ago. Those things worked for 30 years.
Yeah, they
Right?
still
You
work.
got a new one. And, as soon as the warranty sort of goes out, there you go. They updated something, your fridge doesn't work again. So almost look at Spencer. I think we need to go backwards. I swear to God, common sense, basics, right? Eat right, start sleeping, move your butt. We don't do that enough. The kids don't do it enough, and remove that screen time. So the super, super basics, are very important. Although again, it's still much more complicated than that because there's a lot of other things that are, gone wrong in our system. But do you guys agree with that? Do you notice that in your athletes? Because I know you guys are, into super athletic. You're doing NFL and Miami and this and that. Do you guys go back into that specific thing with them, with these, top athletes or not?
Not really, but we do see, like when they're getting treatment on the table, they're on their phones or they have to. But then there's some that I'm very impressed. Some of them, they completely know how to disconnect. And that deserves some accolade because they don't want to be connected to anything. Even some of the adults do the same thing. I ask them, do you want your phone? And they'll say, nah, I just want to relax, you know? So I do have a question for
So
you.
exception to the rule or not the rule? Now you're dealing with an adult, by the way, too, that has a lot of things coming at them.
Yeah.
It's a little different than the kids because the kids' worlds are a little bit smaller, right? So, I'm wondering, because I use athletes all the time, because when my kids are into sports or I bring up sports all the time, I think it's one of the most beautiful EQ things you can possibly do, right? It's a connection, right? With other humans. I say, do you think LeBron does this? Or if they like tennis, Djokovic, or, I bring up the sports stars. I say, do you think they eat this way? How do you think, and if they want to be rich, I say, well, how do you think the entrepreneur spends their time? Do they read? Because reading is, like we talked about, reading is, if they're doing screens, they're really not reading. And if they're addicted to screens, good luck going backwards. But it's much easier if they're addicted to reading, not to get addicted to screens. So one thing I want parents to know, because I know it's difficult. Look, some people there's, one parent households and they have to work. Other times the parents are, just not on the same page. People have to know that even if they're not together with their partner, they must sit down and plan these things ahead of time. Parents must be on the same page when it comes to parenting. They must listen to books. At 18 months, it's a big speech from me for families. I give them different books that I think you should start listening to. I say, quote unquote, I don't believe in terrible twos, but you've heard, everyone knows terrible twos and three teenagers. I say, if you don't get prepared, you're going to be feeling that you're always going to be in a reactive mode. You're always going to be behind. You're going to create habits that it's going to be so much harder to break later. So when we do 80-20 with foods, right? We don't have to be perfect. 80% good, 20% junk, outside, vacations, whatever. I do the same thing. If you don't start habits early, right? In the beginning, it's 20% hard. right? But if you have those bad habits and you want to try to break them, then it's 80% hard breaking it. So, if you want your life to be miserable, right? If you want to go through this, I see it all the time, guys. And I have the best patient population in the world. They're so fantastic. They're so into it. But I see this struggle for those who don't study. Okay. Kids are a lesson for us, right? Kids are a lesson for us to grow ourselves, right? We are responsible for them. They're their own human being. We have to mold, protect them, nourish them, and by guide them into different things so they can learn themselves and they can learn how to have an increased cognitive ability, increased resilience, increased adaptability, and connect to joy, a little bit more rather than what they're experiencing.
Dr. Ed, have you always been like this? Was there a time where you did conventional pediatrics and then had a epiphany or realization that this isn't the right way?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I definitely was not always like this. It was lots of little epiphanies. The biggest one is after I graduated, for 2, 3 years, I worked in Bakersfield. So I don't know if guys know Bakersfield. Bakersfield has one of the biggest farming, so lots of herbicides, pesticides. I remember as I was driving up from LA, the planes would be, with the wings spraying that, and I would drive right through them. So you have all of this massive toxicity from that. Then they also have a lot of oil. So now you have heavy metals in the community, in the environment, stuff like that. That's, you're getting, just exposed to. And they're in a valley. So everything is trapped. So what I realized is, I was very conventional medication, medicine. It was a, pill for an ill approach, right? Conventional medicine, allergy medicine, headache medicine, asthma medicine. So I went from excellent health into chronic allergies, chronic asthma, just like almost 80% of my patients, right? Those kids had so many ear infections that they didn't have one tube in the ear. They had the ENT would just put 3 at a time because they would just come back, you know. So whenever you look, there was 3, and I've never seen it anywhere else ever. So at that time, this was 20 some, a little over 20 years ago. The AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, used to have a step up approach for asthma allergies. So start with, some inhaled corticosteroid, then go to leukotriene, then go to Advir and all of that. So they went up to control the kid. Now, guess what? I'm living in a cesspool, right? And every 2 weeks we bring these kids back and they're still suffering. So at that time, I said, well, this is not working. So just by intuition, I said, no, I'm going to go step down approach. When these kids come in, I'm going to throw everything at them. I'm going to remove things one at a time, right? And that worked. The kids would come in much less, right? So that was, and then 2 years later, the American Academy of Pediatrics actually jumped into what I was doing intuitively. The reason I actually mention this is because we really need to allow doctors to use their intuition and their know-how and and all of their learned abilities, and then share it with the AAP and our other, academies, to work together in order to bring the best things to light, not just a step down approach where just a few people make all the decisions. Because you can pick up these things if there was an easy, like, hey, there's like a little email line where you can just pretty much, write down your thoughts and someone would be, now you can have AI take a look at all of it and then summarize it for them so that we can use all of our, wisdom, all of our talents together. So what happened during those 2 years, I'm like, this is ridiculous. I do a much better job controlling kids. So I felt the fact that I was quote unquote better at that moment from a tradition. But I said, there must be more to this. So when I decided to start my own practice, I took a homeopathic class through Boiron CEDH. It's the number one homeopathic school for doctors. And homeopathy is voodoo. It doesn't make any sense. It didn't make sense to me, before, but after it was magic. It was incredible. It was like phenomenal. So instead of Tamiflu, we did Oslo and elderberry and stuff like that. And I saw kids get better in 2 days, rather than, Tamiflu was still, Tamiflu and those drugs decrease 2 days. They're supposed to decrease the duration. If you really read it, it's 2 to 3 days. So if you do the drug, instead of 10 days, it should be 7. And then it has all these different side effects that you have to like read and see if you have, because a lot of our patients who actually read, they see that they have some side effects. So I saw different magic. A 1-year-old that wouldn't eat, I would put alfalfa homeopathic in the bottle. And then they take it because that could stimulate appetite, right? They would take it and their appetite would increase, and the parents would text me and say, "Hey, this is amazing." Then their pellets would run out, right? And the kids decrease their eating, and then they put it back in, and they increase their eating. So here, where homeopathy doesn't make sense, this is incredible. Plus, like if you guys say that's placebo, well, that's a 1-year-old, right? And they didn't create homeopathy. So, Dr. Henneman 600 years ago in Germany did. So so when you start using different modalities, you start seeing if it works or not. Now, does it work for everybody? No. No, it's not that one, but I've seen it enough. Someone kid doesn't sleep, you give them this, they sleep and they don't, blah, 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 right? So there's a lot of common parent problems. So what I did was when I took homeopathy, I started immediately using it. And it completely changed me. It just, my family members, my friends, immediately as I was taking the course, I would say, "Oh, this is this patient. Oh, that's that personality." I would write down different personalities as I'm learning it. And I would immediately, start using it. And I saw a huge change. So that was the first time I completely like shifted. It was incredible. And after that, I took a lot of functional medicine courses, and what functional medicine does, it really tries to get to the root cause. It explains things from biochemistry to biochemical to toxic load. So you have different ways of trying to understand the body. It gives you, and it also is world medicine, so it adds lots of different ways of treating. So I started learning gemotherapy and herbs and some Chinese stuff, and not everything, but because it's too much of a beast. Started doing different levels of testing. And each one of those, Spencer, changed me. I got more excited. I was more in. And my staff said, "Please, Dr. Ed, stop going to the courses. Stop changing things. Stop. Don't go." You know. But it really it made me fall in love, with the process, and it made me who I am. So it completely I mean, I walk the talk. I have to, my own supplements downstairs because our body doesn't do everything perfectly. It's not, food is wonderful, but, I always say to my patients, we are what? No, no, we're not.
We
We are
assimilate
what we,
what we digest.
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. We are what we absorb. We are what we absorb. We are what we assimilate, so, and I used to say we are what we think, but I also realized that which we think is also what we absorb. So I then put those two things together. So that's what part of what we are. The other thing that we are is we are what we cannot get rid of, right? So we are what we can, right? So if things are inside us, if you're constipated, if the chemicals are already inside, if those forever chemicals are there, or the plastics are there, right? If those things are in there and it's having some effect already, that's part of us too. So that's how we, sort of talk to people. I say we are what we absorb and we are what we cannot eliminate. So in functional medicine and that realm, they really talk a lot about that. And that's how I evolved into who I am now, and I mean, these are part of it, but there's a lot of other crazy
Dr.
stuff.
Dr. Ed, I want to I want to commend you on going against the grain of what traditional medicine is. And I think for the viewers and listeners, I think it's important to just kind of let them realize, because they're told by, to trust these experts, and then there's different experts, and then they often give something completely different as far as advice and different, they don't know who to trust, especially now after this whole COVID and vaccine ordeal. But, just as a realization that the curriculums in schools are age old, and that's who educates the doctors. That one of two types of doctors, the ones that are like you, which are rare, and then there's those doctors that just continue with that same curriculum that they learned in school, and maybe the continuing education they do get is from the pharmaceutical reps.
Mhm.
So, but I would love to ask you your thoughts on I mean, there's these listeners and viewers that have kids, and they don't know who to trust and how. So, if you could touch off on the vaccines and the social media and the public, I would love that.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult. It's hard if your world is getting one message. It's hard to go outside the box. You know, so in medicine, let's just medical school and residency. Again, first of all, Western medicine can absolutely be beautiful. It is very important. I I prescribe medicines. If I have a pneumonia, I'm going to treat the pneumonia. If I have a kidney infection, I don't want the kid to become septic. I will treat that, and then I'll work on different mechanisms to help the gut heal that I've learned that they're not taught in Western medicine. So, so yes, we learn how to suppress things in medicine. That's how we're taught. And yes, it's not evolving fast at all. The world is evolving, but Western medicine hasn't. It's very, very, very slow. The other thing with doctors, again, we're stuck in trusting organizations that, you know, again, I don't want to. It gets complicated. It's hard to know exactly who to trust, like you said, because I really think just when it comes to our academies and organizations, they need to remove any kind of financial gain from different models. So that it's complicit. Like people, doctors, everyone has to say, you know, um, if I own a company, I have to bring it up. And this is what I own. This is what I gain when you guys in Western medicine. There's whether it's the CDC, NIH, all these different academies. eh, there are a lot of patents associated with it. So I think people lose a lot of trust, and I did too, to some extent. I still thank God for Western medicine. I don't, it has a very important role. You have appendicitis, you better cut it out. You only live to see another day. And there's certain things that you really have to, you have to suppress. Otherwise, again, until you can figure out what's causing it. I think that Western medicine needs to just, you know, pull down their guard and, accept world medicine. Who am I to say that Chinese medicine has been 5,000 years? Doesn't work. And why don't we, allow it to, to be, to work? And why not allow nutraceuticals, nutrition as medicine? Like, when I have a constipated kid, I give him some magnesium citrate and I give him some high dose vitamin C as I work on their diets and stuff like that. If they text me like 7 days late, I say, yes, put a glycerin suppository or do a fleet enema. You see how we can be working together. But the vitamin C, guess what? It's a laxative in high doses. So you get diarrhea from it. So you can use a little higher dose to get diarrhea if you're constipated. And then, wash it out rather than Miralax, for example. Right. So there's so many ways. Oh, even omegas, you can do the same thing, right? Fish oil, too much will give you diarrhea. Very few people affect their platelets. And Petechian is so easy to check. Maybe one kid in my 20 years, which I had to slow down. And if something doesn't agree with them, we just adjust. So why not put world medicine? So a lot of doctors, I don't know. I mean, look, I want all the doctors to come and play the game. I know that they'll be happier treating their patients if they accept integrative medicine. And then start taking other courses or demand the medical school and residencies to add that in. There's no classes on nutrition, really. If anything, maybe half an hour in our 4 years. Nothing. There's really not much. I think is changing slowly, guys, but it's going to be extremely slow. And the only way things will change is if there's more demand from both doctors saying, hey, a lot of these patients are asking me about heavy metals or mycotoxins or, glyphosate or something like that. Can we check our kid? And none of them know how if you're just in traditional medicine. And there's not enough demand from traditional medicine to try to, take some of these labs and really, organize it in such a way where they are comfortable, in the sense, okay, this is a lab that's we trust. They don't do that. And there is a lot of labs, and you're not, even that is a little complicated because, you have to know which one to trust, and you may get false positives and false negatives, when it comes down to that. So it's not a super easy answer overall, but if parents, this is part of the parental responsibility that I'm talking about. If parents want to understand, they have to look at both sides, you know, constantly, and then have friends or colleagues or something to sort of help them. Now, here's a weird thing. I am creating an AI version. You don't know this. I haven't told you guys this. I'm creating an AI version of some of the things that I do because I feel like I'm very much in the middle, because I do use Western medicine, but out of the, I would say I use it 10 to 15% of the time, right? Green boogers doesn't mean antibiotics to me. Ear infections doesn't mean antibiotics to me, right? I can do so many things. 80% of my ear infections, I don't have to treat with antibiotics, right? 50% of my sinus infections, I don't. Sinus is much harder, but so there's all these different things. So, my little thing, something that's going to be, released this year, we're working on it, is called Hello Eddie. And that will have wellness mentalities where what I look for in a kid to see if they're autistic or not early on or not, all that kind of stuff. The second thing is the illness stuff. My kid's ear hurts. You go and they say, oh, you go to the urgent care, your ear is red. Here's your antibiotic. Now that's like 98% of the urgent cares, you guys. Okay. So this is what happens when you go to urgent care. You get your antibiotic almost always. And then my patients, they're very picky. They understand they want less. They understand the gut microbiome is, you know, incredibly important. So they, many times, they come in the next day because they needed to just double check. They come the next day to double check with me. About 30% of the time when I'm looking in the ear, it's full of wax. You can't see the eardrum. I'm like, and I show the parents, I'm like, see, you can't see anything. So how can you even know there's an ear infection or not? And then I go to the AAP guidelines. I see most ear infections are viral, right? So you have to, ear pain doesn't mean infection. Ear pain could be fluid in the ear, pushing on the eardrum. It could be sterile, so you don't need antibiotics. Ear pain could be viral. So it's important that we understand that you don't need to treat every ear infection. Even as bacteria, most of the bacteria I treat, but I don't, but we can get away with it with the parent that is very, very on top of things and they come back and recheck quickly, right? Because we don't want ruptured eardrums. We don't want something to go to the mastoids and all that kind of stuff. We don't want secondary complications, which are very uncommon, by the way. So going back to your first thing, the gut microbiome thing is getting killed by the antibiotics as well, right? So going back to your question, vaccine stuff. So when it comes to who do they trust and stuff, again, complicated. Um, Our job as doctors is to give informed consent, right? So that's a Hippocratic oath we took from the very beginning. The problem now is that that is essentially dead. Informed consent is very different than giving a bunch of sheets from the CDC before they leave. So this is what we used to do, and I'm sure this is happening with a lot of practices. They come in, you give them their combo shots, everything, and then they leave with 5 sheets of paper that the CDC had written. And when you give them that, that's their informed consent, right? So that's what happens in the majority of different places, right? So when it comes to vaccines, what I do is I go through every single vaccine. Okay. I talk to them about what is what, which is which, do they work? Do they not work? What's inside? What is first path effect of the liver versus being injected? I talk about the immune system and how time changes the immune system. I look at the risk factors of their lives. So we discuss all the risk factors, like where are they compared to other ones? A lot of my families are fortunate enough that they breastfeed a lot. Most of my patients breastfeed, and most of them are not going to daycare at 2, 4, 6 months. So they can take a lot more risk, right? All the new vaccines versus the old ones. So we discuss each one, and then we talk about, timelines, and then we allow them to choose what's right for their family, right? And one thing you have to notice, the first, what do you say? The first 2 years is the most important for brain. Then the next year, third year, then the next 2 years, the first 5 years. So you have 5 years. So anytime people decide to, if they, let's say they were forced to do it for school, if they even delay some of that stuff until later, responsibly, right? They are decreasing some level of toxic load. So when you go through all of these, now this is, most people may not have context to what I'm talking about right now. Vaccines could be amazing, but they could be damaging. So this is so it's very important that you understand, why do I need a hepatitis B shot in a non-hepatitis B mom, for example, at birth? So it wasn't made for infants in the beginning, right? The history is it was made for the high risk groups, which, at that time it was, what is it for? It was for, you know, um, homosexuals that are doing high risk sex, generally males, and drug users. So that's why they made it, because that's where you get the hepatitis B. But those groups are stigmatized, or they were, or they are, or maybe I don't know now. These days, I don't know anything. But, they changed the age group to infants because they got the vaccines in. Does it work? Yes, it does decrease hepatitis B, but is any young kid at risk for hepatitis B? Right? So I have families who come in, they're like, oh, they're scared by their pediatrician. You may cut their nails and you may cut them and they may can get hepatitis B. This was literally a month ago. The fear that they brought up to the patient when it comes down to it. Yeah, like their parent had hepatitis B, but there's this misinformation part of it makes it complicated, and then there's, this slogan called safe and effective. So it's beautiful. You say it enough and you have enough experts that say it becomes believable. So okay, safe and effective, then remove the liability for pharmaceutical companies. So because if it's safe and effective, then so that's not going to happen. So it's complicated in a sense because you know um you want studies done, vaccinated kids versus non-vaccinated kids, in order to really understand how much it helps them. And the latest studies, there's, one there was a University of Detroit that did a big study during COVID. And it was a very pro-vaccine doctor that compared vaccinated versus unvaccinated. He wanted to sort of tell the, families who are not unvaccinated, here you go. See, they're fine. And what he realized after the study, and again, this is through the university, very, reputable doctor, what he realized that ADHD, sensory processing, behavioral issues, asthma, allergies all went up, right? When they're, vaccinated, So now I really want you guys to understand that I'm not at all anti-vaccine, so, and I don't think I'm categorized that at all. And a lot of my patients vaccinate, So what's important is, you know, what risk factor you are, what level of risk do you want to take? You know, does certain things help the community or not? Do you have a family history yourselves of being more sensitive? Because we don't have specific gene testing and stuff like that when it comes down to, it's coming. There's some esoteric things that says, these may be associated. So I would really honor those families that have a history of vaccine injuries. And I would listen too, right? It's not like they're all anti-vax. Most people are not anti-vax. Most people are ex-vaxxers, whether it's personal or family member or a friend or something like that. So that stuff again dehumanizes. And I don't want politics in my practice. So when it comes down to understanding this stuff, it's a little harder to sort of find the truth if you're Googling it, because most of Google and stuff like that will be very one-sided. And also, here's the other problem. If you're also just Googling, you hit the other side, which is totally like against everything. There's no reason. There's no that's where your anti-vax comes in with people who say something without doing any studying at all. So there's rules, but we have to honor each family and their history and their risk factors. We can't say I'm okay, just giving a whooping cough vaccine, to some kid that has tons of aluminum, formaldehyde, something like that, that would have a family history of one, you know, and risk the damage to that kid for a long, long time, you know, just to say I'm protecting the community, which again, it gets complicated because how well that works or not works is not brought up either. So what I do is I just really talk a reason, I don't want, I give my patients every option to do everything. So you can, shoot every vaccine at the same time, but just so you're aware, there are no studies that studies all vaccines at the same time. So they've studied them separately, and then even those are a little bit complicated when you go into the ingredients of placebo or not, right? But there's no studies that does them at the same time, so, but because I give my patients options, some of them do all at a time. That's the minority. Many of them spread it out. That's the majority. And some people don't do it at all. And some people move for their schooling, right? So it's, they take responsibility because they honor their kids' bodies,
Hey,
and even that's very political,
hey, Doc, I
Yeah.
want to interject for a second. What advice do you give when you have the person that either doesn't want to take the vax, or you've in your exam discovered they shouldn't take the vax, yet the pressure they get from the school systems, the society? What advice do you get them of how to navigate that? Because if they want their kid to go to school, but the school's saying they can't go without this stuff, how do you advise them?
It's complicated, Terry, right? So I still say you're the parent. You have to take responsibility. You have to honor your kid's body, right? If they have no family history of anything, they can, at a certain age, they can start taking risks. We prime them with homeopathy and we use different levels of detox pathways and spread it out. So a lot of people choose, to do that way, or they take the responsibility for their kids. There's different types of homeschools that allow a lot of kids, in them, and this is again very political. A lot of my patients move. They're still with me because they can text video and audio anytime the kids get sick. But if they really want to be in a regular school system, they decide to go to a school, the state that doesn't force it. This is why I hate politics involved, in medicine. Right? It's not right, but again, this is a very naive way of talking. It's not right. Medicine should be, I want it pure, right? I learned a lot of things. I'm like, oh, wow, world medicine is so beautiful. Oh, vaccines. There are people who sat down in front of me that talked about how their kids changed, and they told their doctor. And the doctor said, oh, don't worry, just give some Tylenol and stuff like that. The kid is feverish for about 3 days. This is the typical story that I learned. Okay. Feverish 3 days, squealing and sleeping a ton more. And then they don't, and then when they wake up and stuff like that, and that's gone, they don't recognize. And the first person who usually notices this is the mom. And they're usually telling the doctor, calling him, and then the doctor says, give Tylenol, which again reduces glutathione, which is one of the more important protectors, right? So as you go through this, none of these people are related to one another. This is brought it all shock to me. I traditionally never talked about this stuff, at all, so when I just listened and I listened deeply and the stories were the same among a lot of individuals, then I'm like, wow, I need to, really go much more deeper. That's when I went really deep into trying to learn every vaccine, what they are, how they work, stuff, everything like that. And the history of disease, and how, when did the vaccine come in? What did it do? And all that kind of stuff. So again, there's a role, but it needs to be much more flexible. And it's hard to be flexible. It gets dirty. It's, it's much harder for a doctor, right? As well. You have to take time to counsel, and good luck. You have 15 minutes and you have no education. So now, how do you do it? You can't, right? You're supposed to do things really, really fast, and I used to do that. And, when I was super traditional, I never thought twice about it, and it was just part of when I said, yeah, yeah. And I used to say, yeah, those are just anti-vax illness. That's exactly, but when I listened and I started learning, I took that red pill, right? A matrix, and when you do that, your life gets much more complicated, right? But there is freedom. And with that freedom, you have to then learn a lot more. So I took a lot more responsibility, which every parent has to do for themselves. So no anti-vax here at all. I know each role. I know when I'm going to give each one to my kid and stuff like that, how I'm going to give it, why I'm going to give it. I feel in control overall, and I may have to move, fully. I don't know, and if I have to, fine. Or, if have to homeschool, I will. But, I cannot, say that, I don't break the law. So that's the problem, right? So, if you want change, it has to be done where parents say, hey, we want, we need more information. We have, if something happened to our kids, or why do we have 55%, you know, illness rate? We need to examine all of these parameters, not just vaccines. Lysphate, mycotoxins are horrible, very complicated. I can't tell you how many kids, when I see and treat mycotoxins in my practice, how much of their behavior changes. Unbelievable. Their feeding, their tantrums, their chronic conditions improve. It's completely missed in Western medicines, right? Parasites we don't talk about, right? So we have to think about that. Lyme is so underdiagnosed, right? So there's a lot of things that we're not thinking about. And we really need to. But, if nothing else, we still have to come back to the basics, right? Eat whole foods, nutritious, remove as much pesticides and herbicides as possible. No one has to be perfect. Okay. So, I hope they're not perfect. I say I don't want you to be perfect because that's a lousy life. You know, you know, you know, sleep well, don't do screen time anywhere close. Make sure you put strong rules associated with screen time in the beginning. From 2 up, whenever you start introducing, there's rules. Grandma gives you some gift, you know, before you open it, you say, these are the rules if you want me to open it. Is that agreed on? Every kid, yes, daddy, yes, mommy. They say yes to anything because they want to play, right? But that's your rule. Now you have to enforce it. So put the rules before you bring the vice, right? The device is your biggest vice. So put the rules in and then make sure you have plans for them, right? Activity, move your gluteus maximus, get into a team sport. It's wonderful. Start playing music. It changes it. Start reading, learn a foreign language, go outside and hug a tree, work with nature, learn about nature. You can use your AI and you should use AI to some degree because that's their life, which is, again, I haven't figured this out. It's going to be horrendous, with what's going to happen, next. So, that's the way I would say. I don't have a very easy answer, but, first parents have to get educated, and no matter what, they have to take responsibility. And I feel horrible for the single parent that's in survival mode, that lives in certain states that they force them because, then you sort of like completely give away. And God forbid you have a family history because a lot of people will be lucky, and they'll be okay. But there's also a lot of people, and I'm talking about, in the millions that are not, and then you see that in the payouts, when it comes down to vaccine injuries overall, that it's not talked about. And that's a minimal of what's real out there. So not anti-vaccine, pro-health, vaccine informed, make wise informed decisions when it comes down to it. Decrease your toxic load as much as possible because, and then start demanding more. Demand more from your doctor, demand more from your government, but it's a big, massive lift, bro. Guys, I have no idea. The only good thing, I'm going to leave you with this, or, I think we're running out of time, right? But, the good thing is I think there's a trend right now that's starting to shift more into wellness, that there's more and more parents, wanting to have some alternatives just to the asthma medication and allergy medicine. So I think that even doctors may start getting stimulated in terms of learning more. So I'm praying for that, people, with your shows and all that kind of stuff, and what I will do, again, part of my Hello Eddie app is really interviewing people who do things differently, bringing their magic to light, whether it's when it comes down to panda syndrome or autism or, we have miracle stories where, I had a kid on 6 seizure drugs, CHLA, nothing worked. They came to me, went to, we had to hospitalize. As soon as they came to me, we had to hospitalize her. It's, at Cedars, and then Cedars was giving the same drug. She's like, the mom's like, I already done this. So they're recycling. So when they came to me, I got a team integrative approach. We helped clean the gut, and then we started giving different minerals and vitamins and stuff like that, and absorption, detoxification pathways and stuff like that. They joined me, I think 4 years ago, right? It took us, a year and a half to go down to 1 drug, and then she's off drugs for the last year. So she's drug free, 0 medications. This is a very complex seizure disorder. These are people I'm going to interview because I want people to have hope in order, when they have these chronic conditions, that it's not just a pill for an ill approach. We need a lot of more functional medicine doctors, integrative doctors, all the doctors where they have their own kids and they're suffering. Because I see different doctors and they have kids who have chronic conditions too, right? And they're stuck themselves. So I'm hoping all of them get stimulated in one way or another, not being anti anything. I'm not anti medicine. Every drug they give, I give if I need it. I just give it so much less, so I feel so much better when it comes down to it.
Dr. Ed, that was a very smooth landing into the end of the program, and I really commend you on going against the grain of what traditional medicine has unfortunately provided. And I think you're really turning the tides. No, I don't think. You are absolutely turning the tides on the perspective, starting with the parents, and those are the strongest voices. Dr. Terry, I know that we have to have him on again because we have 10,000 other questions for you that we couldn't even get to. You answered everything so deliberate and so clear, and I appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciate you. We're all in it together. traditional doctors meeting non-traditional doctors, holding hand in hand, learning from each other, so we can advance and do the best thing for why we became doctors. And chiropractors don't get enough credit. I'm glad you guys do. It's incredible the magic. I use craniosacral therapists with my infants on, I'd say once a year. They should, the older kids, because their postures are sort of ridiculously horrible because of this. And I'm like, if you want an AI not to hurt you, become an orthopedic doctor, because all the neck surgeries are going to be just so ridiculous and so massive, later on. A lot of chiropractors do a lot of functional medicine as well. So I really appreciate your role, because, when I was in medicine, there was several chiropractors in my medical school, and we didn't really understand the incredible role you guys play. So I'm glad you guys broke out, but I want the world to understand that each of osteopathic doctors, naturopathic doctors, homeopaths, midwives, all of these different beautiful people need to be bred in for unity. There needs to be unity among us. I'll leave you really with this. This is my last thing. My holding company is called Fun, which will do, which will bring up different labs and different things that I'm later on what I'm going to do. It's called Fun stands for freedom. We need, freedom to choose, to understand, to think critically when it comes down to things, right? Unity between all of the different modalities of treatment. N is for nurturing. We need to stop gaslighting. We need to listen and understand and be much more nurturing than we do. And then the other N is for nexus. The nexus connects all of these things together. So, that represents who I am. This is why I love, this. I want that unity to happen so that everybody has more freedom and much more understanding when it comes down to this incredible, most important thing, which is our health. So thanks again, you guys.